Hello, everybody. It's Craig and Richard with you, and this is the week 3 feedback video. And it's great to be with everybody. Great to be with you, Richard. And really, what a challenging topic self-compassion can be. One of the things that's really stood out this week is just a really supportive community. People bringing not just compassion to themselves, but the interactions between learners, and it's just really lovely to read how deep the support is, and there's sort of a sense of community among our thousands of learners doing this course at the moment.
Definitely. And it's such an important time, of course, to be doing this, because we're predicting that there are going to be increased rates of mental health problems coming out of this. You know, there's the isolation and there are people facing all kinds of challenges. So now is a time that we need to be kind to ourselves.
Yeah. I think we need mindfulness in many ways more than perhaps at other times when life is flowing a little bit more predictably and easily. And I guess it's the unpredictability of life, the capacity to let go and to, adapt, to step into the unknown a bit, that perhaps, is why a lot of people are interested in mindfulness at the moment.
Yeah, there was a really touching story, Craig, from one of our learners who'd had COVID actually and had been recovering at home. Took them 8 weeks to recover, and they were living alone at the time. And so I think that course came at a very good time for them, and they said that they were practicing self-compassion. That was helpful, but they were also just loving how much support they were getting from other learners when they posted about their challenges, other learners really jumping in and supporting them and encouraging them. So that was really beautiful to read as well.
Yeah, a lot we're noting that practicing self-compassion is not so easy. I can't wonder why. Why would that be?
I wonder if our default setting, perhaps, or our learned behaviours are to not perhaps be so compassionate with ourselves. And perhaps, it's turning the Titanic in some ways for a lot of people, isn't it? Really learning to relate to ourselves in a fundamentally different way to the way that we might have learned in our families. Even the messages society gives us. I mean, you turn on the TV and, of course, advertising is famously telling you you're not enough, got to be better, make yourself look better, wear some better clothes, drive a better car. I mean, all these messages we get bombarded with are the opposite of self-compassion. They're the opposite of self-kindness and self-acceptance. So I think that's probably a large part of the reason why it's so hard.
Yeah, and perhaps social media can accentuate that a little bit too much as well, that our sense of self-worth and self-esteem seems to be so dependent on so many other things, so potentially fragile. I think this self-criticism is a kind of a low awareness habit. It's a kind of a stream of default thinking running in the background, mind commenting, etc. And really the first part of being able to deal with any habit is bringing awareness to it, to actually noticing that it's happening. And as frustrating as it might be, if we are noticing more of the self-criticism, then that's actually the first step in the solution to the process, not another source of self-criticism. What's wrong with me? Why can't I stop criticizing myself? Which is just another kind of cycle, like another kind of loop to get into. And
and I think it's true that for a lot of people, this habit's been there sort of just bubbling away in the background for their whole lives. And so, of course, as you start to notice it, it can become quite confronting, actually. It can be quite confronting, but as you said, it's a very good thing to notice it. And then we can start to perhaps, change that habit, particularly, I think, as you said, by not shooting that second arrow or that third arrow of self-criticism about the self-criticism, right? That's very important to do.
It's 100 arrows there, just up one after the other. But
looking like a porcupine right
now. A lot of our learners are really connecting with Kristin Neff's sort of help with how to deal with this sort of self-talk and so on. I sometimes wonder, who is talking to who? All this incessant self-talk and commenting on the self, like who it is it talking and who's listening? And who are we? You got an answer to that?
Craig, you're out in space right now. You're getting very philosophical there. But I think it's a great question, isn't it? Because at the end of the day, it's us talking to ourselves. And that's at the heart of Kristin Neff's work and at the heart of what self-compassion's about. There are parts of us that might feel a bit vulnerable and insecure. And then there's another part which shows up, and how that part relates to the vulnerable parts of ourselves is so important. So if we're tough and critical or judgmental even pushing ourselves to improve and be better and try to get sort of, feel good through that. That's it. The research shows it's not as healthy as if we speak to those vulnerable parts of ourselves in a kinder, more accepting way, letting them know that they're accepted, that they're okay. And once we do that, the different parts of ourselves come into a much better relationship. And from that ground, from that place, we can still perform well, we can still have good relationships, but it's motivated not by trying to better ourselves or prove ourselves, but by just, already knowing that we're whole and complete as we are, and that, we might still want to do good work or be kind to others or be useful for others. So it's just a different motivation.
Yeah, I guess when there's a little less of our ego, all of our cluster of ideas about ourselves, when there's a little bit of less of that in the picture, it probably makes all of this a whole lot easier. And I think that the non-attachment bit, the standing back and observing bit, standing back from that mental chatter and so on, can really start to give us a little bit of distance, a little bit of freedom from it. The common humanity is something that's resonated with a lot of learners this week as well. And perhaps one of the silver linings of dealing with adversity, when it's not just happening to one person individually, but it's happening to us all collectively, is that for many that's really turning in a very positive way into a sense of common humanity, more compassion for others, and I think that's one of the things that really strikes home, and it did a lot during the the bushfires earlier in this year in Australia. Is that the sense of community, the sense of caring for others, it doesn't just help people to recover on a material level, get back and build another house and financially get through it. It's the whole human side of how people get through that, and the way that caring for others really relieves one's own stress and distress as well. It's a kind of goes both ways in a sense.
Definitely, yeah. And I think, as you said, it's, I guess, one of the silver linings of COVID that we're all in this together. So it does help us to remember that we're connected through our difficulties, through our suffering and our stress, rather than being separate. Because I think it's when we're struggling and we feel completely separate from everybody else that it really compounds the problem and makes it so much harder.
Yeah.
There were some fantastic comments or questions this week about self-worth, because we were looking at self-esteem and self-compassion and what Kristin Neff said about that. And someone asked, is self-worth part of self-esteem or is it part of self-compassion? Which I thought was a really great question. And my response to that would be that, self-worth is self-worth, and we can draw, we all need to feel good about ourselves. But where we draw that sense of, identity and good feeling from is really important. So if we're drawing it from self-esteem, we need to somehow build our self-esteem or pump our self-esteem to feel good about ourselves. But if we're drawing it from self-compassion, if it comes from that basic sense of just being, accepting our common humanity, accepting that we're okay and that we're enough as we are, that self-worth comes from a very different place, and I think that's what a lot of the research is pointing to. If we have to do something, I see this all the time in my clients as well, if so many people are driven and, they might be quite successful, but often inside they feel like an imposter, like a little bit empty, or they're feeling stressed, or they're burning out because they've got to keep proving themselves. And the work that we often have to do there is just to, practice some self-acceptance. Because from that ground of self-acceptance and really accepting ourselves as we are, not because we are doing well at things, but just, our inherent worth as a human being, it just gives us a beautiful ground. And from that ground, from that sort of calmer place, as I said a moment ago, then we can still do really great things in the world, but it just doesn't have that drivenness. We don't have to stay on that treadmill. We can take better care of ourselves, step off if we need to. And it feels less empty and it feels somehow more complete inside. It's a beautiful journey to see people go through, actually.
Yeah. I think too, what mindfulness can teach us about coming back to that simple sense of being, just coming back to that core of our being, and that's standing back from all of the thoughts and assumptions, all the stuff we think about ourselves that we normally take to be ourselves. And I think when the self-worth comes from that, then it's a lot more enduring than putting all of our worth, all of our value in the ideas I got about myself, my image to others, because that's an incredibly fragile thing. And ultimately, I think we kind of have the opportunity to learn that that's not worth as much as we might have thought. But I think we have to kind of get back to that level, the core of our being, that awareness. And the meditation helps us to go deeper to that. And that's where perhaps our worth is. And I think that one of the things that strikes me about people who really have a sense of that sort of inner self-worth are also able to be vulnerable or to admit a mistake. I think it takes an enormous amount of self-respect, for example, to make a mistake and to feel strong enough in yourself to be able to admit it, to be able to not be perceived as perfect. And there's a kind of a real inner strength if somebody is able to do that, and which is not a common kind of characteristic these days.
No, but it is nice that the research increasingly shows that, and it's getting out there into the common understanding. And you'd certainly like to see it in places like politics, wouldn't you? The ability to make a mistake and just own it. So, okay, well, we thought one thing, but it's actually something else, and let's move on. It's a very different world. Yeah,
I'm human. I'm a work in progress, and I think perhaps the way that intense self-criticism can come up when a mistake is made, especially for somebody who's in the public eye, it creates a tremendous kind of fear and reticence to just be an authentic human being in the public eye. And so it takes a special kind of self-respect to be able to do that. There's been a lot of interest this week as well about the self-compassion when facing difficulties meditation as well. And so some learners have been practicing that. Others have found that it's been tremendously helpful in terms of a release. And some have actually found some struggles with that too, and because it's not an easy practice.
No, well, of course, all of which is just part of the process. I mean, the whole point of it is to start retraining our mental habits. So that moves us in a direction of self-compassion, but it also shows us perhaps where we're not being very compassionate with ourselves. And there's no right or wrong experience that people should be having. I mean, a lot of people often feel quite sort of calm and content, or sort of a warm glow in their heart afterwards. But some people also feel, one of our learners said they're feeling very sad. Another one said they felt somehow detached, as if they were in a movie set that had kind of frozen up. And these are all just normal experiences when we meditate. There's this myth that meditation should always lead to us feeling good. And it's a very good myth challenger to try to get away from. Because if we expect meditation to leave us feeling good, and then afterwards we feel sad, or we feel anything that's other than good, we might think, oh, I'm doing this wrong, or I've failed, or it's not working for me, and maybe get into one of those self-critical loops. So if we can accept that, when we practice, it's going to show us things that need attention. It's going to show us what's already happening deep inside. I think that's a very good approach. And if we bump into something like some sadness or a feeling of detachment, that can actually be a sign of progress, I think, as we start feeling into things that were there already. But it's really important how we relate to that, because if we make ourselves wrong for that, or think it's a problem, or we've somehow screwed up the meditation, that's moving away from self-compassion. Whereas if we just accept, okay, this is what's happening right now, and that's okay, even that is an act of self-compassion.
So to just make space for it and just to be with it with awareness, but a kind of a self-compassion that this is what's arisen, but that making space for it rather than fighting and reacting to it seems to be a very healing thing.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it's a very important thing.
A lot of learners are interested in the rewiring the brain for happiness as well, and there's hope for us all. This is a kind of a lifelong project, and one of the things that a lot of learners have been connecting with, and especially when there's so much time indoors for many people now, is that time of getting outside and connecting with the senses and in nature, and hearing sounds and smelling the smells and seeing the sights and the stuff, has really been very rich kind of sensory experience. And it seems to have quite naturally flowed into savouring food more, and that kind of a sense of gratitude and the simple pleasures in life, which are often missed while our mind's kind of running 10 steps ahead of us, thinking about always the next thing we've got to do, and not savouring this moment now. And it's been great to hear how many learners have really been savouring much more.
Yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? And I just love the idea that we can train any habit. We can stop training self-criticism, stop training unmindfulness. We can start training mindfulness. We can start savouring experiences and being grateful for, pleasant things that are happening in our lives, and just hardwiring that into our brain. Interesting questions about the negativity bias, Craig, and the evolutionary basis of that. Why, obviously there is a negativity bias. I think that's pretty patently clear if anybody starts to watch their own mind. But where did that come from? Why do we have it? And we're having an interesting chat before this about, is there an evolutionary basis, or?
Well, we are just assuming that cavemen and women tens of thousands of years ago had a negativity bias. I don't know. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But certainly here now, it's certainly become enculturated now. Whether it's a survival thing or not, I'm not so sure. But you got any reflections on that?
Well, look, I think it's a good question. I mean, it makes sense. Like the theories that, obviously it's come from somewhere, and the theories about the evolutionary basis and trying to survive and needing to worry about what was over the horizon and what was rustling in the bushes, they all make sense intuitively to me. But I think your point's really good, that it doesn't really matter that much. The reality is that right now we have a negativity bias, and what are we going to do about that? Rather than thinking about where did it come from and why is it here, I think we'd be better served just retraining it, to be honest. Doing some meditation and training ourselves to either focus on the positives through gratitude and savouring, or just to not get caught up in those negative loops in the first place.
Yeah, going for that morning walk and saying, oh, the council should be fixing up this path. Look at that. Some of the concrete's broken there, and there. Somebody should. It's like, and it's a kind of seeing a negative side of things rather than just seeing things, and
Yes.
So who knows? But yes, I guess that's the point. We here now have the opportunity to live under that negativity bias, or to do something different. Without needing to say too much about it, a number of learners have also found that the pain meditation very useful. And of course, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, the principles of practicing mindfulness with pain are very much the same, but many learners finding it's very helpful because of that, removing that amplifying effect of our emotional reaction to the pain and fixation on it and so on. And, one learner, is it the physical exercise I was doing that was reducing the pain, or is it the mindfulness? And it's probably a whole range of things. And mind you, if you're outdoors for physical exercise, you're probably being more mindful anyway. And so one thing probably feeds on the other as well. But it's certainly very helpful, I think, to bring mindfulness along with any other treatments we might be having to the management of things like physical pain, which, of course, are common symptoms. Yeah.
Yes, it was beautiful to read some of those comments. It clearly really helped some people this week, Craig, the pain meditation. That was really nice to read.
Yeah. So anyway, that's all we've got for this week. I'm about to get out of range of the satellite again as I rotate around the Earth and from my elevated position here. But so next week, so it's the final week of the course, and we've got a 20-minute meditation practice and choiceless awareness. Be looking at other things like mindfulness and ethics, and how to maintain a mindfulness practice in daily life after the end of this course. So thanks to all our learners, and thanks to you, Richard, and I look forward to being with you next week.
See you then.